some fine little masterpieces by Tusi Tala, Edinburgh's teller of tales. In particular, I want to share my enthusiasm for Robert Louis Stevenson's Fables, a small corner of his collected works, not often celebrated, perhaps not often read. They're strange and disconcerting, not the kooky RLS some people want to see, but also not quite the gruesome horror writer of Jekyll and Hyde, or the adventure story writer, or the travel writer, though elements of all of these might be found in the Fables. These little stories have the ability to capture our attention. In fact, they caught the imagination so strongly that the RLS Club sponsored a competition earlier this year for the best fable written in the style of Stevenson in 350 words or less. I'll speak more about this and show you the winning entries in a few minutes. So, what is it like to read Stevenson's Fables? Maybe we should begin with a short fable addressing the problem of being disappointed, not to say offended, by an author whom you expected something different from. It's called The Reader. "I've never read such an impious book," said the reader, throwing it on the floor. "Oh, you need not hurt me," said the book. "You'll only get less from me second-hand, and I did not write myself." "That's true," said the reader. "My quarrel is with your author." "Ah, well," said the book, "you need not buy his rant." "Well, that's true," said the reader, "but I thought him such a cheerful writer." "Well, I find him so," said the book. "You must be differently made from me," said the reader. "Let me tell you a fable," said the book. "There were two men wrecked upon a desert island. One of them made believe he was at home. The other admitted, 'Oh, I know your kind of fable,' said the reader. "They both died." "Well, so they did," said the book. "No doubt of that. And everybody else." "That's true," said the reader. "Push it a little further for this once." "And when they were all dead?" "Well, they were in God's hands, the same as before," said the book. "Not much to boast of by your account," said the reader. "Who is impious now?" said the book. And the reader put him in the fire. "The coward crouches from the rod and loathes the iron face of God." This fable seems to be about reading and not judging a book by your expectations from the author's previous books, a problem Stevenson himself ran into many times, people expecting certain things from the author of A Child's Garden of Verses, or Treasure Island, or Kidnapped, or Jekyll and Hyde, and then being disappointed by, The Ebb Tide, for instance, in a different style. But of course, this fable is not just about a disappointed reader. Stevenson's fables are seldom as simple as that. Often there's the actual story, and then some other meaning emerges as we attend to the fable more closely. We're told nothing directly about this reader, but we can learn something from his, let's call him a man, we can learn something from his first sentence. "I've never read such an impious book." What kind of person talks like that? Judging a book as impious. Isn't this the kind of person who sets up some moral standard by which to judge everything, dividing the world into those who agree with him, the pious, and those who disagree, the impious, happy to use religious labels to condemn these others? Impious, well, that takes care of them. Now, within the fable, you notice that was a fable within a fable, it seems to be the crux of the issue, even though it is incomplete. We can guess its ending, though. Two men lived on a desert island in two different ways. One, whom we might call a dreamer, pretended that he was in his hometown and was contented. The other, a realist, accepted the fact that he was lost on a desert island and was discontent because he was stranded away from home. Here were two people in the same circumstances, but interpreting these circumstances in two different ways. And yes, they both died. showing that they were, after all, similar in both being mortal human beings, despite their different interpretations. They were divided by their views when living, but united by dying in the end. The reader, however, cannot accept this unity. If people do not agree, he insists that one must be wrong and the other right. So he pushes the story further. What happens after they die? He expects the answer to be that one will go to heaven and the other one will go to hell. But the book answers that these two men are both in God's hands, the same as before, no matter what their views were. Not much to boast of by your account, says the reader. He's implying that there is no satisfaction in being in God's hands if the other person who disagrees with you is also in God's hands. Now, this really is impious, denying that God is a loving God. Who is impious now, asks the book. What does a self-righteous person like this reader do but get rid of whatever challenges him to readjust his views? So he throws the book into the fire. What appears as a straightforward dialogue may not be as simple as we thought or as we expected. You can see that there are two impulses at work here. There is Stevenson as Tusitala, the master storyteller, and there is what his wife called the Scotch Stevenson, who confessed that ethics was his veiled mistress. The ethics Stevenson was promoting, as we can tell from this fable, showed the absurdity of a sanctimonious, judgmental religion, short of itself, when, in fact, human nature and moral issues are too complex for us to be sure about anything. The answer is not to retreat into a kind of moral relativism, but, as we see in many of the fables, to engage with the practical details and relationships there in front of us. You don't throw a book into the fire or onto the floor, even if you dislike it. Practical reflections will tell you that you will only get less for it secondhand. But let's go back to the storytelling here. What narrative features can we identify in this short fable? Perhaps we notice first the simplicity, the minimalism. There are two pieces of action framing the fable, two versions of the same attitude. In the first line, the man throws the book onto the floor. In the last line, he throws it into the fire. What happens in between? Between these actions, there's nothing but dialogue. There's no description, no specific location, no background. It could take place anytime, anywhere. Except, of course, it couldn't take place because it is unrealistic. The story features a book that talks. Almost, but not quite, what books do. So despite the apparent realism of the dialogue, the story is basically a fantasy. Does that give it extra charm? Extra universality? There is a violent ending, shocking in it. If we think throwing a book into a fire is a violent ending, which it's shocking in its suddenness, but perhaps also a little comic. Do we briefly smile at the end, just out of surprise? There's no symbolism in the story, though throwing the book into the fire might remind us of the old practice of burning heretics at the stake. Besides the minimalism and the shocking ending, there are other elements that make us uneasy. Perhaps most of all, the unfinished fable in the middle of the fable, asking us to play with it further and see what arises. The fable teases us to interpret it, or at least to play with ways we might apply it to the world around us. And then there is the moral attached at the end. Few of Stevenson's fables contain a moral, but when a moral does appear, it's usually more cryptic than the story itself. The coward crouches from the rod, and loathes the iron hand and loathes the iron face of God. Play with this yourself. See what you make of it. Why is the reader a coward? Why, in his mind, does God have an iron face? Stevenson is not going to hand it to you explicitly. So the reader, the fable called The Reader, gives us an indication of the style of these fables. But let's go over these storytelling techniques a little further. First of all is the compression, or as I called it, the minimalism. Like The Reader, most of the fables have very little narrative or description, only the most essential descriptive details. And I think there's some analogy with the Bible narratives too, but let's not go into that. We almost never are taken inside a character's mind. The fables also, in this way, enact Stevenson's famous rejection of realism with its focus on character and accurate detail in favor of a reliance on dialogue and action. We're not asked to get emotionally involved with the characters, but to stand at a certain distance apart. A good place for seeing the irony. Okay, here's some examples from the fables. Here's an example of minimal description, the opening of the fable, The Sick Man and the Fireman. There was once a sick man in a burning house to whom there entered a fireman. That's all, then the dialogue. There's only a few deadpan comments in the midst of the dialogue until the final unexpected ending. Sometimes the story begins directly with speech, as in The Sinking Ship. "Sir," said the first lieutenant, bursting into the captain's cabin, "the ship is going down." Many fables follow the pattern of a short opening narrative followed by dialogue. See how this works in the short fable, The Devil and the Innkeeper. Once upon a time, the devil stayed at an inn where no one knew him, for they were people whose education had been neglected. He was bent on mischief, and for a time kept everybody by the ears. But at last the innkeeper set a watch upon the devil and took him in the fact. The innkeeper got a rope's end. "Now I'm going to thrash you," said the innkeeper. "Oh, you've no right to be angry with me," said the devil. "I'm only the devil, and it's my nature to do wrong." "Is that so?" said the innkeeper. "In fact, I assure you," said the devil. You really cannot help doing ill?" asked the innkeeper. "Not in the smallest," said the devil. "It would be useless cruelty to thrash a thing like me." "It would indeed," said the innkeeper. And he made a noose and hanged the devil. "There," said the innkeeper. This is a much more complex fable than it might at first appear to be. I'll try to take it further later if we have any time. But notice how little we've been told and how far we can nevertheless take it farther. Here's another short fable following that pattern of narrative and then dialogue, but it's a much more formalized way. 2 sentences setting up the basic situation, followed by 2 cycles of dialogue. The 4 reformers. 4 reformers met under a bramble bush. They were all agreed the world must be changed. "We must abolish property," said one. "We must abolish marriage," said the second. "We must abolish God," said the third. "I wish we could abolish work," said the fourth. "Do not let us get beyond practical politics," said the first. "The first is to reduce men to a common level." "The first thing," said the second, "is to give freedom to the sexes." "The first thing," said the third, "is to find out how to do it." "The first step," said the first, "is to abolish the Bible." "The first thing," said the second, "is to abolish the laws." "The first thing," said the third, "is to abolish mankind." That's it. We are left to work it out if we can. We may be tempted to look for symbolism, for instance, in their meeting under a bramble bush, but I don't think that will take us very far. In any case, in their meeting under a bramble, in any case, it pulls us away from the story itself if we start making up symbolism. Hiding under a bramble bush just seems a good way to keep intruders away. We may also be tempted to identify each of the speakers with various political causes. But where does that get us? No, the meaning, if that's what we're going for, is found in the dialogue itself. The first three propose abolishing something very general, almost cliche: property, marriage, God. The fourth says something practical: I wish we could abolish work. But this person is ignored in favor of what they call practical politics, as if anything the first three have said is practical. In the second round of dialogue, with the fourth reformer elbowed out, each of the three has two goes at proposing various first things to be done: giving freedom to the sexes, finding out how to do it, abolishing the Bible, abolishing the laws. The third reformer then sweeps the whole argument away with the proposal that the first thing is to abolish mankind, leaving us in something like shock, or at least puzzlement. Perhaps we laugh at the absurdly cynical conclusion: the only way to reform the world is to get rid of its worst pollution, mankind. Well, what's wrong with mankind? From the evidence of this dialogue, what is wrong is that no one listens to anybody else. There's no back and forth. Each throws out isolated statements. If even idealistic reformers have no respect for other people, then what's the point? All this, I propose, comes from the dialogue itself, not from trying to read hidden meanings or abstract principles. The focus is on the dialogue. Another feature is the universality of the stories. The stories take place in no identifiable place or time. There are some slight exceptions to this general point. The Poor Thing is set in the islands, probably Scottish islands, but that's never made clear. Something in It is obviously set in the South Seas during the 19th century, but that's a pretty broad identification. The Scientific Ape is set in a certain West Indian isle and deals with contemporary issues of vivisection. The Clockmaker deals with contemporary findings about germ theories and evolution. These two, the Scientific Ape and the Clockmaker, are the exception, and it may be for this reason that they were the two excluded from the original edition in 1895, published only as late as 2005. For the most part, there's no specific identification of the characters, keeping the focus on the dialogue and actions only. A man met a lad weeping. In a certain city, there lived a physician who sold yellow paint. A man quarreled with his friend. Once upon a time, there came to this earth a visitor from a neighboring planet. Incidentally, is this fable, The Distinguished Stranger, the first story in our literature to feature a visitor from a neighboring planet? Well, you get the idea. Fables unfettered to a specific, realistic time and place. Similarly, only two characters, besides Long John Silver and Captain Smollett, only two characters have names, though one of them, Jack, is about as universal as any English name. Otherwise, we're shown generic characters: a sick man, a fireman, a man, his friend, a lad, the missionary, the elder son, the king's daughter of Duntrine. No, that sounds like a place, name of a real place, but it's made up. The king's daughter of Duntrine. Perhaps the most noticeable feature of Stevenson's fables, though, is the language. Stevenson always seemed to be using language in his own way, coming out with strange phrases that may or may not be reminiscent of the Bible, or Shakespeare, or Scots, or feel like translations into English from French idioms. The distinctive feature is what many saw as Stevenson's charm, but many others, especially in the 20th century, saw it as affected and disqualifying the writer from serious consideration. This language, I am saying, this language is alive and dynamic, however, and creates the specific effect I think Stevenson was going for. A slightly strange, out-of-the-ordinary English that removes us from the everyday world of realism and gives the writing its timeless flavor. All right, here are some examples of Stevenson's strange language. In The Two Matches, a tree caught in the midst of a burning forest will fly in fire upon the instant to its topmost bough. Fly in fire? I've done an edition of the Fables for Chinese students of English with tons of footnotes. I'm going to put a fly in fire. How do you tell a Chinese student, that this is not really idiomatic? Don't use this phrase, because we don't do that in English. Someone fleeing from the fire will gallop for his soul. In The Yellow Paint, a young man is run down by a water cart and cut off in the heyday of his nakedness. I looked that up. Where in the Bible? That must be in the heyday of his... It's nowhere. The people in the house of Eld who must live with gyves riveted to their ankles go about unhandy on their feet. The house of Eld itself was a fine house and a very rambling. We heard how the devil at the inn kept everybody by the ears. In the fable, Faith, Half Faith, and No Faith at All, we're told not that 3 men went on a pilgrimage, but there went 3 men upon pilgrimage. 2 more examples. In The Poor Thing, the hero is given by his dead ancestors a token, if we want to call it that, of the shoe of a horse, and it rusty. And it's repeated again and again. The shoe of a horse, and it rusty. In The Touchstone, the king has a smile that was sweet as clover, but his soul with insides was as little as a pea. You can look up with insides, thinking it might be biblical or Middle Scots or something like that. But you'll find that Stevenson's story was the first recorded appearance of the word. One other author is listed as using the word, Rudyard Kipling, who almost certainly copied it from Stevenson, as he would. I've been speaking mostly of the shorter fables, but there are several in the collection that would be more accurately identified as modern, even distorted, fairy tales. And it's here that Stevenson brings out his talent for unforgettable, eerie description. I've mentioned the house of Eld, a fine house and a very rambling, but feel the eerie power of the description. Let's have a fuller reading of the house, the home of the Wizard of Eld, as the hero, Jack, approaches it. He came to that wood and entered in, and he was aware of a house in a low place where funguses grew and the trees met, and the steaming of the marsh arose about it like a smoke. It was a fine house and a very rambling. Some parts of it were ancient like the hills, and some but of yesterday, and none finished. And all the ends of it were open, so that you could go in from every side. Yet it was in good repair, and all the chimneys smoked. Jack went in through the gable, and there was one room after another, all bare, but all furnished in part, so that a man could dwell there. And in each there was a fire burning, where a man could warm himself, and a table spread where he might eat. But Jack saw nowhere any living creature, only the bodies of some stuffed. Or we can share the description in The Poor Thing of the fisherman hero who was bitter poor in goods and bitter ugly of countenance, as he ferries the poor thing, a ghost-like apparition who will eventually lead him to his bride and then be born as the fisherman's son. They are headed to the little Isle of Sheep where our fathers lie in the dead cairn. So the man rose and put forth his boat at the time of the sun setting. And the poor thing sat in the prow, and the spray blew through his bones like snow, and the wind whistled in his teeth, and the boat dipped not with the weight of him. I'm fearful to see you, my son, said the man, for methinks you are no thing of God. It is only the wind that whistles in my teeth, said the poor thing, and there is no life in me to keep it out. So they came to the little Isle of Sheep, where the surf burst all about it in the midst of the sea. And it was all green with bracken, and all wet with dew, and the moon enlightened it. They ran the boat into a cove, and set foot to land. And the man came heavily behind among the rocks in the deepness of the bracken. But the poor thing went before him like a smoke in the light of the moon. So they came to the dead cairn, and they laid their ears to the stones, and the dead complained with insides like a swarm of bees. Time was that marrow was in our bones, and strength in our sinews, and the thoughts of our dead, and the thoughts of our head were closed upon with acts and the words of men. But now we are broken in sunder, and the bonds of our bones are loosed, and our thoughts lie in the dust. I'll leave you to come back to the story and see what happens next. But we cannot discuss Stevenson's eerie descriptions without also bringing in what I think is one of Stevenson's great masterpieces, The Song of the Morrow. It's not an easy tale to make sense of, and what sense we do make of it is rather bleak. But we prize it especially for its atmosphere and haunting language. The princess hero of the story, known only as the king's daughter of Duntrine, grows up in an isolated castle by the sea. I contend it's near Gillen Sands, but that's for another day. Now, it befell that she walked one day by the beach of the sea, when it was autumn, and the wind blew from the place of rains, and upon the one hand of her the sea beat, and upon the other the dead leaves ran. This was the loneliest beach between two seas, and strange things had been done there in the ancient ages. Now the king's daughter was aware of a crone that sat upon the beach. The sea foam ran to her feet, and the dead leaves swarmed about her back, and the rags blew about her face in the blowing of the wind. So there she meets the old crone, who puts into her head the thought of the morrow and the desire for power upon the hour, so that she can no longer live like simple folk. She returns to her masoned house. Mason is not an English word, but here it is. A masoned house. And the princess sits in feckless pondering for 9 years, until one day she and her nurse hear the sound of piping and return to the beach. So they went down in the dusk to the doors of the house and along the beach of the sea. And the waves beat upon the one hand, and upon the other the dead leaves ran, and the clouds raced in the sky, and the gulls flew widdershins. And when they came to that part of the beach where strange things had been done in the ancient ages, lo, there was the crone, and she was dancing widdershins. What makes you dance widdershins, old crone, said the king's daughter, here upon the bleak beach, between the waves and the dead leaves? I hear a sound in the wind that is like the sound of piping, quoth she, and it is for that I dance widdershins. For the gift comes that will make you bear, and the man comes that must bring you care. But for me, the morrow is come that I have thought upon, and the hour of my power. How comes it, crone, said the king's daughter, that you waver like a rag, and pale like a dead leaf before my eyes? Because the morrow has come that I have thought upon, and the hour of my power, said the crone, and she fell on the beach, and lo, she was but stalks of the sea tangle, and dust of the sea sand, and the sand lies hopped upon the place of her. This is the strangest thing that befell between two seas, said the king's daughter of Duntry. That's not all. More strange things happen. And it's always wonderful to read these stories because you hit the sand lies hopped upon the place of her. What a, just one odd phrase after the next. Perhaps that's enough tasting of the distinctive atmosphere in these larger tales. What other features are there? Stevenson follows the conventions of the fairy tale, but always with a twist in it. In the touchstone, it's not, as tradition dictates, the younger brother who is the hero, but the elder. And the virtuous prince does not marry the princess in the end, who anyway has been revealed by the touchstone to be but a mask of a woman, and with insides she was quite dead, and she smiled as a clock ticks, and knew not wherefore. In the House of Eld, Jack does, like all fairy tale heroes, succeed in his quest to find and kill the evil wizard. But when the people are released from their painful spell, they simply shift voluntarily to a different form of suffering. And Jack discovers that in killing the wizard, he has also killed his uncle, his father, and his mother. The fisherman in The Poor Thing, though bitter poor in goods and bitter ugly of countenance, does in the end marry the Earl's daughter. It's not a marriage of love, however, but simply obeying the natural force to perpetuate the race. That's important, especially in the light of 19th century genetics that Stevenson was very interested in, but it's not the kind of resolution we usually find in fairy tales. Fables, and sometimes fairy tales, have a moral at the end. Here's a question. Have you recently read Aesop's Fables? I'm afraid you'll find them pretty bland, straightforward, with no real kick to them. At the top of one of the manuscript pages of his Fables, Stevenson has a tentative title, Aesop in the Fog. His morals leave us in a fog, not just because Stevenson usually refuses to offer a pat moral solution. As Long John Silver says in the fable The Persons of the Tale, which is good and which is bad? Stevenson is not going to get trapped into deciding this for us. So when he does offer a moral at the end of a tale, it will be, well, foggy. We saw the foggy moral at the end of The Reader. The coward crouches from the rod and loathes the iron face of God. Or how about this, at the end of The House of Eld, in the voice of ancient prophecy or wisdom literature? Old is the tree and the fruit good, very old and thick the wood. Woodman, is your courage stout? Beware, the root is wrapped about your mother's heart, your father's bones, and like the mandrake comes with groans. Or the moral of Something in It. The sticks break, the stones crumble, the eternal altars tilt and tumble. Sanctions and tales dislimn like mist about the amazed evangelist. He stands unshook from age to youth upon one pinpoint of the truth. I resist the temptation for now of going further into these morals. Here's the plug. I invite you to read my suggestions in the collection I have entitled Aesop in the Fog, and to play with them yourselves. And I think that's truly the end or purpose of these stories, to let the dialogue and action, the description and language resonate with insides and see where they take you. Now it's time to move to the second part of the talk about the RLS Club's competition for the best short fable in the style of Stevenson, now that we sort of know what the style of Stevenson is. That was the brief. We could tell from so many of the submissions that they had no clue what the style was. They never read, they thought it was Aesop, or something. That's right. The competition initiated, organized, and managed by the very talented Martin White began on Stevenson's birthday, 13th of November 2021, with the deadline for entries by the beginning of April. The competition was open to anyone, welcoming non-UK entries, but the stories had to be in English. Of course, those in American were not disqualified, though the one entry in Scots was disqualified, since although he used a few Scots words, Stevenson did not write his fables in Scots, which would have made it too localized and not universal. Entries could not exceed 350 words, which excluded imitations of the longer fairy tale-like stories in the collection. Writers were advised to focus on dialogue rather than narration, and were given a list of possible themes. The inversion or parody of conventional wisdom. The absurdity of abstract thinking separated from action. The stupidity of closing oneself off from the people one is interacting with. The heroism of persisting even in hopeless causes. The danger of too much self-obsession, including self-reproach for your sins. Martin White's list here can actually give us a pretty comprehensive sense of Stevenson's concerns in his fables, and indeed in much of his life and writings. Over 450 entries were submitted. Some were, and most of them like within the last 3 days, of course. Most of them, well, some of them were clearly not suitable, perhaps because they contained no dialogue. Didn't you read the rules? Some were written in verse, and not always very readable verse. Some were too sweet, or too conventional to be Stevensonian. And some, alas, were too gratuitously cruel to be considered further. Stevenson's things are violent, but they're never gratuitously cruel. There were several that came in with the topic, write a fable in 350 words. And you could see it was a school assignment. There's a whole class that must have seen. The teacher never said Stevenson style, she never taught this, and so these are things like, if I read another one about, Jimmy the Bunny was hopping down the road one day. I think you have to expect that for a competition. Martin and I compiled a short list, and a panel led by Alan Taylor, including Rosemary Goring, Natalie Jack, and me, chose the winner and 2 runners-up. The announcement of the winner took place at the Stevenson Conference in June at Natalie's University Bordeaux-Montaigne. Let's look at the winning entries. First, the 2 runners-up. Stomach or Soul is a very short fable, only 4 lines long. Its brevity did not disqualify it. Stevenson's fable, The Tadpole and the Frog, is only 2 lines. All right, I'll read it. Be ashamed of yourself, said the frog. When I was a tadpole, I had no tail. Just what I thought, said the tadpole. You never were a tadpole. All right, even in its brief space, Stomach or Soul, the submission Stomach or Soul, follows the pattern of many of Stevenson's fables, with a brief opening to set the scene, a dialogue, though here it's simply conducted by a man within himself, and a final line that twists the situation into a new, unexpected direction, pivoting around the word but. The character is unidentified. This could be any of us. Oh, no, not me. Well, it could be. Not me. Stomach or Soul by Helen Uritic. A man was down to his last $5. I could buy a loaf of bread to feed my hunger, he thought. Or I could buy a bunch of flowers to feed my soul. But he bought a lotto ticket and fed the system. The man considers the two essentials of life, physical nourishment and spiritual nourishment. Both options are desirable. We're left in suspense for a moment, waiting to see how the man will resolve this unresolvable dilemma. Are we surprised that he chose neither option, but instead bought a lottery ticket? No, perhaps we're not really surprised. The cynical side of us just nods at the weakness of taking this impractical gamble. The real power, though, comes from the witty final words, he fed the system. A nice connection to a colloquial phrase, and I wonder, is that more American than British, to feed the system? I can't tell these things anymore. It plays on our secret sense that the system always wins. I'm not sure Stevenson would fully agree with that, but then he didn't live in the 20th century. The other runner-up was a more elaborate fable called School Clothes, a drama in 3 parallel scenes, giving it a formal structure that builds to the final scene as we wait in suspense for a resolution, which of course comes in an unexpected way. The narrative is minimal. Everything is told to us through dialogue. We're given a girl and her mother. It's not clear how old the girl is, but we probably should think of her as an innocent but canny pre-teen. All we know about the mother is that she performs the very basic household chores, dusting, folding laundry, washing up. Her advice to her daughter feels, well, you decide what it feels like. School Clothes by Caris White. One day, a little girl returned home from school very upset. What's wrong? Asked her mother, busy dusting the furniture. A boy told me I shouldn't wear blue at school because I'm a girl, she said through tears. Well, blue is quite a dull color anyway, darling. Perhaps he's right. Pink would suit you better, the mother replied. Oh, you're quite right, Mother. I'll choose a more feminine color tomorrow. The next day the girl came home and she was again very distressed. What's the matter? The mother asked, busy folding laundry. I wore pink today, Mother, and a girl told me I looked like a marshmallow. A marshmallow? Well, perhaps she's right. Nobody wants to look like a marshmallow, do they? Replied her mother. You're quite right, Mother. I'll choose a more neutral color tomorrow, said the girl. The next day, the little girl came home and she was very cheerful. How was your day? Asked her mother, busy doing the dishes. Well, Mother, I didn't wear blue or pink today, and nobody talked to me at all. It was wonderful. I got to concentrate on all my work and enjoy myself. Even the teacher ignored me. What on earth did you wear today, darling? Nothing at all, the girl replied. I was naked. All right, that's a clever twist, and you're always going to catch a reader's attention if you end a story with the word naked. Like many of Stevenson's fables, this fable stirs up several responses. There is the very current issue of gender identity, specifically here judging the girl by how well she conforms to gender stereotypes. Then, too, the issue of school bullying from the other girls, whom one would have hoped might have been more sisterly. Our heroine bounces back, though. It's not clear that she knows how clever she is by coming to school with no outward signs of identity. Being naked, metaphorically revealing her true self, unaccommodated, as King Lear says, gives her freedom. because no one in this society cares to look at her true self. Like many of Stevenson's characters in the Fables, and perhaps especially in the longer ones, once you move beyond society's rigid standards of respectability, you are free, though you may find yourself alone. This girl has enjoyed being alone, ignored, allowed to do what she likes all day. It is absurd to have to take off all your clothes in order to be free from bullying, but it's also absurd, the fable shows us, to judge a person by how well her clothes or words or actions conform to expectations. That's absurd too. Just as the girl's nakedness evades the other's expectations, so the fable itself, like many of Stevenson's fables, breaks down our own expectations with its shocking, even scandalous ending. And finally, the winning entry. The young man and the therapist. The fable creates a formal, dramatic pattern with a series of parallel complaints by the young man and responses by the therapist, gradually leading us to the climactic final action. We're told nothing about the characters except that one man is young, whatever that means, and the other is a therapist. Everything else we have to interpret from their own words. Here's the story. The Young Man and the Therapist by C.B. McCall. A young man was walking with his therapist. "I'm so sad," he said. "My true love has abandoned me." "Ah," said the therapist, "but that's the past. Mindfulness tells us to concentrate on the here and now. Look at this delightful purple heather blowing in the winter sunshine." "Well, and I'm so anxious," said the young man. "I've been distracted at work, and I'm sure my boss is going to fire me." "Ah," said the therapist, "well, that's the future. Mindfulness tells us to concentrate on the here and now. Listen to these seagulls calling as they wheel above the cliffs." They paused at the highest point of the bluff and looked out over the sea. "I'm so hungry," said the young man. "I keep trying to remind myself of the good breakfast I ate before I came out. But that is the past, and mindfulness tells us to concentrate on the here and now." "Well, yes," said the therapist, putting his hand on the young man's shoulder. And what you are experiencing offers an excellent reminder that bodily sensations anchor us in the present moment." "Well, and I'm so cold," said the young man. "That wind is biting. I keep trying to remind myself that there is a warm fire waiting for me at home. But that is the future, and mindfulness tells us to concentrate on the here and now." "Indeed," said the therapist, squeezing the young man's shoulder firmly. "And what you are experiencing offers an excellent opportunity to accept the present without trying to change it." "Then I suppose I must accept what a wretched creature I am," the young man said. In the present moment, I have no relationship or career. I'm ravenous, I'm freezing, and my only human contact is with a man who offers no advice other than to get used to it." And he stepped forward over the cliff, dragging the therapist with him as he fell. Do we laugh at this ending? Yeah, obviously. Because it's unexpected. But do we stop in some kind of, shame? I mean, who laughs at this kind of violence? But it's only a story. Its formal pattern reminding us that it is fiction, not real life. And perhaps we then smile at the aptness of this way of clearing the air of the therapist's smug, cliched replies. Many people, me too, I think, might be shocked by this because they know that it is important to accept the present moment without projecting it into the past or future. Only then, after all, can we actually do something about our problems. But that shouldn't stop us from recognizing that this therapist operates without any sympathy. His wise advice is not just ineffective. Without sympathy, it's harmful, especially for someone as vulnerable as this young man. In fact, there's an additional irony in that the therapist's retreat into cliched advice shows that he too is not living in the present moment. He is absurd.